people like you don't belong here." The words echoed across the courthouse lobby, sharp enough to make conversation stop mid-sentence. For a brief moment, the entire room seemed frozen. Attorneys carrying case files slowed their pace. Visitors waiting on wooden benches looked up. Even the security staff near the entrance exchanged uneasy glances. The comment had come from Officer Brian Walker, a veteran courthouse officer known for taking his job seriously, but this time, something about his tone felt different. Standing just a few feet away was a woman named Maya Johnson. She didn't argue. She didn't raise her voice. She simply looked at him with a calm expression that seemed almost impossible under the circumstances. And somehow, that calm reaction only appeared to frustrate him more. What nobody in that courthouse realized was that they were witnessing the beginning of a moment that would soon turn into a story people would be talking about for years. Before we continue, take a second to subscribe to the channel if you enjoy powerful stories about justice, unexpected twists, and real-life lessons that stay with you long after the video ends. Now, back to the story. Maya stood quietly near the entrance, dressed in a simple navy blazer and carrying a small leather folder. There was nothing flashy about her appearance. She didn't arrive with an entourage. She didn't introduce herself to anyone important. To most people passing by, she looked like an ordinary visitor preparing for a routine day in court. But while everyone else saw someone ordinary, Brian seemed determined to make her the center of attention. He stepped closer and asked for identification. Maya politely complied. After reviewing it for several seconds, he handed it back without explanation. The interaction should have ended there. Instead, Brian continued watching her. Every time she moved a few feet through the lobby, his eyes followed. Every time she spoke quietly to a clerk or checked the schedule board, he seemed to find another reason to question her presence. The tension was subtle at first, but people nearby were beginning to notice. What made the situation even stranger was Maya's response. She never appeared nervous. She never appeared angry. If anything, she seemed patient, almost as though she expected every word that was being said. A young attorney standing near the elevators noticed the exchange and frowned. An older court employee glanced at Maya twice before quickly looking away. Small reactions. Easy to miss. Yet they hinted that there might be more to this woman than anyone realized. Brian, however, seemed completely confident. From his perspective, he was in control of the room. He had authority, experience, and a courthouse full of people who generally followed his instructions without question. What he didn't know was that several people had already begun paying very close attention to how he was treating Maya Johnson. And before the morning was over, one unexpected revelation would change everything. Maya slowly walked toward the main hallway that connected the courthouse lobby to several courtrooms, her pace steady and unhurried. Behind her, Officer Brian Walker remained focused on every move she made. Most visitors would have been rattled by the attention. Most people would have either left the building or challenged him directly. Maya did neither. She simply continued as though she had an appointment to keep and no intention of allowing distractions to change her plans. That quiet confidence was becoming impossible to ignore. As she approached a large directory mounted on the wall, she stopped briefly and reviewed the courtroom schedule. Brian immediately stepped forward again. "What case are you here for?" he asked. Several people nearby glanced over. The question itself was not unusual, but his tone carried an edge that made the interaction feel less like routine security and more like a personal challenge. Maya turned toward him. "I am here on official business," she replied calmly. Brian folded his arms. "Official business for who?" Maya looked at him for a moment before answering. "The appropriate people know why I am here." The response seemed polite enough, but it clearly irritated him. He expected explanations. He expected compliance. Instead, he was getting short answers and an unusual level of composure. As the seconds passed, a few attorneys entering the hallway began paying closer attention. One of them, Daniel Brooks, slowed his pace and studied Maya carefully. There was a flicker of recognition in his eyes, but it disappeared almost immediately. He continued walking without saying a word. Maya noticed him, but her expression never changed. Brian, however, missed the exchange entirely. His attention remained fixed on proving that something about this woman did not belong. He asked another question. Then another. Each time, Maya answered with the same measured calm. The more patient she remained, the more determined Brian appeared to become. Meanwhile, something subtle was happening throughout the courthouse. A clerk at a nearby desk looked up after hearing Maya's name. Another employee whispered quietly to a coworker. Neither interaction lasted more than a few seconds, yet both suggested that some people recognized her. The strange part was that nobody approached her directly. It was almost as if they were intentionally keeping their distance. Near the end of the hallway, a courtroom door opened and several people stepped out after a morning hearing. Among them was Judge Robert Harrison. He exchanged greetings with a few attorneys before his attention briefly shifted toward the lobby. For less than a second, his eyes settled on Maya. Then he continued walking. To anyone else, the moment seemed insignificant. But Maya noticed it. And Southwest did one court employee standing nearby. The employee suddenly looked nervous. Back in the hallway, Brian took another step closer. He had become convinced that Maya was hiding something. What he did not realize was that nearly everyone who recognized her was choosing not to intervene. They were watching. Waiting. Observing how the situation unfolded on its own. And with every passing minute, Officer Brian Walker was unknowingly placing himself under a brighter spotlight than he could possibly imagine. The atmosphere inside the courthouse continued to shift in ways that Officer Brian Walker either could not see or chose to ignore. What began as a routine morning was slowly turning into something far more unusual. Maya Johnson had reached a seating area outside one of the larger courtrooms and quietly taken a seat near the wall. She placed her leather folder on her lap and reviewed a few documents without appearing concerned about the attention surrounding her. Brian watched from several yards away. To him, her calm demeanor felt less like confidence and more like defiance. After several minutes, he approached again. This time, people noticed immediately. A pair of attorneys standing near the courtroom entrance stopped their conversation. A court reporter gathering materials slowed her pace. Even a security officer stationed down the hall looked up from his desk. Brian stopped directly in front of Maya. "I still have not received a clear answer about why you are here," he said. Maya looked up from her folder. "I have already provided the information required of me," she replied. "And I am exactly where I am supposed to be." Brian frowned. "That is not for you to decide." Maya remained composed. "Actually, it is." The exchange was brief, but it carried enough tension that several people exchanged uncomfortable looks. Brian seemed determined to establish authority, while Maya appeared completely unwilling to be intimidated. What nobody could understand was how she remained so relaxed. Most visitors would have become frustrated by now. Some would have complained. Others might have left altogether. Maya simply waited. The longer she stayed calm, the more attention Brian attracted to himself. A few minutes later, Daniel Brooks emerged from another courtroom carrying a stack of files. As he passed through the hallway, he glanced toward Maya again. This time, the recognition on his face was unmistakable. He immediately looked away and continued walking. Yet his reaction did not go unnoticed. A clerk standing nearby followed his gaze toward Maya before quickly returning to work. Another employee quietly whispered something to a colleague. The pattern was becoming impossible to ignore. People knew something. They just were not saying it. Brian, however, interpreted the growing attention differently. He believed others were watching because he was maintaining order. Confident in that assumption, he decided to press further. He asked Maya additional questions about her destination, her schedule, and the purpose of her visit. Each answer she provided was respectful, concise, and carefully measured. Not once did she become emotional. Not once did she lose patience. The contrast between their behavior was becoming increasingly obvious to everyone nearby. Then something happened that briefly changed the mood. One of the courtroom doors opened, and a senior administrative employee stepped into the hallway carrying several folders. The moment she saw Maya, she froze. It lasted only a second. Then she immediately adjusted her expression and continued walking. Maya acknowledged her with a slight nod. The employee quietly nodded back before disappearing around a corner. Several witnesses noticed the exchange. Brian did not. Had he paid closer attention, he might have realized that the woman he kept challenging was not an ordinary courthouse visitor. But by now, he was too focused on proving himself right. And with every unnecessary question, every public challenge, and every attempt to assert control, he was moving one step closer to a revelation that would soon leave the entire courthouse in stunned silence. By late morning, the hallway outside the courtroom had become noticeably quieter whenever Officer Brian Walker and Maya Johnson were in the same area. It was not because anyone had been told to watch them. It was because people could sense that something unusual was unfolding. Maya remained seated, reviewing documents with the same calm focus she had shown all morning. Brian, meanwhile, appeared increasingly determined to challenge her presence. What began as occasional questions had evolved into something more public. Every interaction now seemed designed to draw attention. As attorneys, clerks, and visitors moved through the corridor, Brian repeatedly stopped near Maya and questioned her in a voice loud enough for others to hear. He asked where she was going. He asked whom she planned to meet. He asked why she had not provided more information. Each time, Maya answered respectfully. Each time, her responses became shorter. Not because she was intimidated, but because she understood that repeating herself served no purpose. The contrast was becoming impossible to ignore. Several people standing nearby began exchanging looks whenever Brian approached. A few even lingered in the hallway longer than necessary, curious to see what would happen next. Brian either failed to notice or simply did not care. He appeared convinced that he was proving a point. Then he made a decision that shifted the mood completely. Rather than allowing Maya to wait quietly, he began questioning her in front of a growing audience. A group of visitors standing near the courtroom entrance could hear every word. A pair of attorneys stopped reviewing their files. Even a court reporter paused while organizing paperwork. "You seem to think the rules do not apply to you," Brian said. His tone carried enough irritation that several people looked up immediately. Maya closed her folder and calmly met his gaze. "The rules apply to everyone," she replied. "That is exactly why I am here." The answer confused some listeners and intrigued others. Brian interpreted it as another attempt to avoid his questions. "You still have not explained yourself," he said. "I have explained everything required," Maya answered. "Nothing more is necessary." For a moment, neither spoke. The silence seemed to spread through the hallway. Then Brian shook his head and let out a quiet laugh that carried more frustration than amusement. The reaction immediately drew attention. People who had been trying to ignore the situation were now openly watching. Maya remained composed, but the atmosphere had changed. This was no longer a routine interaction between courthouse staff and a visitor. It had become a public test of patience, professionalism, and judgment. Across the hallway, Daniel Brooks noticed the exchange from a distance. This time, he did not leave immediately. Instead, he remained where he was, observing carefully. Nearby, the same administrative employee who had recognized Maya earlier appeared again. The moment she saw what was happening, concern flashed across her face. Yet she still said nothing. More and more people seemed aware that something important was being overlooked. Brian continued forward, completely confident that he understood the situation. Maya continued waiting, completely confident that she did not need to explain anything further. And somewhere between those two opposing certainties, the entire courthouse was moving closer to a moment that would change the direction of the day forever. The tension that had been building throughout the morning was now impossible to ignore. Although no announcement had been made and no official concern had been raised, a growing number of people seemed unusually interested in what was happening around Maya Johnson. She remained seated outside the courtroom, occasionally reviewing documents inside her leather folder, completely unbothered by the attention surrounding her. What stood out was not her behavior, but the reactions she continued to receive from others. One by one, courthouse employees who passed through the hallway appeared to recognize her. Some looked surprised. Others looked cautious. None of them approached her directly. It was almost as though they understood something that everyone else did not. Officer Brian Walker noticed the unusual glances but drew the wrong conclusion. He interpreted them as confirmation that his suspicions were justified. The more people watched, the more confident he became that he was uncovering something important. Meanwhile, several attorneys gathered near a courtroom entrance quietly exchanged observations. Daniel Brooks stood among them, listening more than speaking. When someone casually asked if he knew Maya, he paused for a moment before answering. "I think I have seen her before," he said carefully. The response sounded simple enough, but his expression suggested there was much more he was choosing not to say. A few feet away, a court clerk overheard the conversation and immediately looked toward Maya. The clerk then glanced down the hallway as if searching for someone. Moments later, she disappeared through a side door. Small details. Tiny moments. Yet together they formed a pattern that was becoming increasingly difficult to dismiss. Maya herself seemed fully aware of the attention. Every now and then, someone would pass by and offer a subtle nod. She would politely return the gesture. There was no conversation. No introductions. No explanations. Just brief acknowledgments that carried significance nobody else could understand. Brian continued monitoring the situation. By now, his focus had shifted beyond simple questions. He appeared determined to prove that Maya was withholding information. The problem was that every attempt to challenge her produced the opposite effect. Her answers remained professional. Her demeanor remained calm. Her patience never seemed to run out. Around noon, another unusual moment unfolded. Judge Robert Harrison emerged from a conference room accompanied by two senior court administrators. As they walked through the hallway, one administrator quietly pointed in Maya's direction. The judge's eyes immediately shifted toward her. He slowed his pace almost imperceptibly before continuing forward. The interaction lasted only seconds, but several people noticed. Daniel Brooks noticed. The court reporter noticed. Even one of the security officers noticed. Brian did not. He was too focused on his own assumptions. What nobody realized was that multiple conversations were already taking place behind closed doors. Phone calls had been made. Messages had been exchanged. Certain individuals within the courthouse were quietly confirming information. The answers they were receiving only deepened the mystery. Maya Johnson was not simply another visitor waiting outside a courtroom. And very soon, circumstances would force that truth into the open. Until then, the courthouse remained suspended in a strange state of anticipation, as if everyone could sense that a major revelation was approaching but nobody knew exactly when it would arrive. Just after noon, the waiting ended. The hallway outside the courtroom had become unusually crowded, not because of any scheduled hearing, but because people seemed reluctant to leave. Conversations were quieter. Movements were slower. The sense that something significant was about to happen had settled over the entire floor. Maya Johnson remained seated, reviewing documents with the same calm focus she had maintained all morning. Officer Brian Walker stood several yards away, watching her closely. He still believed he was uncovering a problem. He still believed his suspicions were justified. Then the courtroom doors opened. Judge Robert Harrison stepped into the hallway and looked directly toward Maya. This time, there was no brief glance and no attempt to hide the interaction. The judge walked straight toward her. The moment people noticed what was happening, conversations stopped. Attorneys lowered their voices. Clerks paused their work. Even courthouse visitors seemed to sense that this was different. Brian watched with visible confusion as Judge Harrison approached Maya and extended his hand. "Miss Johnson," the judge said warmly, "thank you for your patience." The hallway fell silent. Maya stood and shook his hand. "Not a problem, Your Honor," she replied. Brian's expression immediately changed. The exchange was clearly not what he expected. More surprising was what happened next. One of the senior court administrators who had been seen earlier quickly joined them. Then another. Within moments, several respected officials were gathered around Maya, greeting her with a level of professional respect that could not be mistaken. People nearby exchanged stunned looks. Daniel Brooks closed the file he had been holding and quietly smiled to himself. He had suspected the truth for hours. Now everyone else was beginning to understand. Judge Harrison turned toward the group and spoke clearly enough for those nearby to hear. "For those who have not yet met her, this is Maya Johnson, Senior Federal Civil Rights Investigator." The words seemed to freeze the hallway. Several people looked from Maya to Brian and back again. A court clerk actually stopped mid-step. One visitor quietly whispered, "Federal Investigator," to the person beside him. Maya remained composed. She showed no sign of satisfaction and no interest in drawing attention to herself. The revelation alone was powerful enough. Judge Harrison continued. Ms. Johnson is conducting an official evaluation related to professional conduct and procedural standards involving multiple public institutions. The meaning became clear almost immediately. Maya had not been in the courthouse by accident. She had not been an ordinary visitor. She had not been lost, confused, or withholding information. She had been there on legitimate federal business the entire time. Brian's confidence seemed to disappear all at once. For the first time that day, he appeared uncertain. His eyes moved across the hallway as he realized how many people had been quietly watching events unfold. More importantly, he realized that many of them had known who Maya was long before he did. The mystery that had dominated the courthouse all morning had finally been solved. Yet for Brian Walker, the revelation was only the beginning. Because as courthouse officials continued speaking with Maya, another truth was becoming impossible to ignore. Every interaction from that morning had been witnessed. Every public exchange had been observed. And very soon, questions would begin to be asked about far more than Maya Johnson's presence in the building. For several long seconds, nobody seemed to know what to say. The revelation had changed everything. The woman many people had assumed was an ordinary visitor had turned out to be a senior federal investigator, and suddenly the events of the morning looked very different. Officer Brian Walker remained where he was, trying to process what he had just heard. Around him, conversations resumed in low voices. Some people appeared surprised. Others looked as though they had expected this outcome all along. Maya Johnson, however, showed no sign of triumph. She simply continued her discussion with Judge Robert Harrison and the court administrators, speaking in the same calm, professional manner she had maintained throughout the day. That composure only made the contrast more noticeable. As courthouse staff returned to their duties, several officials quietly gathered near the judge. Documents were exchanged. Brief conversations took place. Maya answered a few questions and occasionally referenced notes inside her folder. Nothing dramatic happened, yet the atmosphere remained tense because everyone understood that the morning's events had not gone unnoticed. Daniel Brooks watched from across the hallway. He noticed something that many others missed. People were no longer paying attention to Maya. They were paying attention to Brian. The focus had shifted completely. Earlier, he had controlled every interaction. Now he was the person being observed. A few minutes later, another familiar figure entered the courthouse. Police Chief Michael Reed had arrived for a scheduled meeting with court officials. As he stepped into the hallway, he immediately sensed the unusual mood. Several employees greeted him, but their expressions seemed distracted. Judge Harrison approached him and quietly requested a brief conversation. The two men stepped aside along with one of the senior administrators. Although nobody could hear what was being said, the discussion quickly became serious. Michael Reed listened carefully, occasionally glancing toward Maya and then toward Brian. The chief's expression grew more concerned with each passing moment. Meanwhile, courthouse personnel began reviewing routine records from the day. Visitor logs were checked. Security procedures were discussed. Standard documentation was gathered. What made the situation significant was not a single incident. It was the pattern that was emerging. Multiple witnesses had observed the interactions throughout the morning. Several employees had independently reported similar observations. The details were remarkably consistent. Brian slowly began to realize that the issue was no longer about Maya's identity. The issue was his conduct. For the first time all day, uncertainty replaced confidence. He looked around the hallway and noticed how many people had witnessed the exchanges he once considered routine. Across the room, Maya finally closed her folder. She exchanged a few final words with Judge Harrison before preparing to enter a conference room. As she walked past, she did not stare at Brian or make any attempt to embarrass him. In fact, she barely acknowledged the attention surrounding her. That quiet professionalism left a stronger impression than any argument ever could. And as the conference room door closed behind her, one thing became clear to everyone watching. The story that had begun with assumptions and public scrutiny was now moving into a very different phase, one where facts, witnesses, and accountability would determine what happened next. The remainder of the afternoon unfolded very differently from how anyone had expected the day to begin. Inside the conference room, Maya Johnson met with court officials, administrators, and representatives from several public agencies. Outside, the courthouse continued operating as usual, but an unmistakable sense of curiosity lingered in the air. People had witnessed enough to know that important conversations were taking place behind closed doors. They simply did not know the details. Officer Brian Walker remained on duty, but the confidence that had defined his behavior throughout the morning was gone. Every glance from a coworker seemed heavier than before. Every routine interaction felt different. For the first time all day, he appeared aware that others had been observing him as closely as he had been observing Maya. Meanwhile, Police Chief Michael Reed spent much of the afternoon reviewing information with court administrators. Security records were examined. Visitor documentation was verified. Witness accounts were collected. None of this was unusual in itself. Professional organizations regularly reviewed procedures to ensure standards were being followed. What made this situation different was the number of people who had independently reported similar concerns regarding the interactions that morning. As the review progressed, a clearer picture began to emerge. Witnesses consistently described Maya as calm, cooperative, and respectful. They also described repeated questioning that appeared unnecessary after her credentials and authorization had already been confirmed. The consistency of those observations drew attention. No single statement determined the outcome. Instead, it was the combined weight of many separate accounts that mattered. By mid-afternoon, word had quietly spread among courthouse employees that a formal review would likely take place. Nobody celebrated the news. In fact, many seemed disappointed that circumstances had reached that point at all. Most people preferred seeing public institutions function smoothly and professionally. Yet they also understood that accountability was part of maintaining trust. Late in the day, Maya emerged from the conference room carrying the same leather folder she had brought that morning. Several officials walked with her toward the main entrance. Judge Robert Harrison thanked her for her time. Senior administrators expressed appreciation for her professionalism. The conversations were respectful and straightforward. There was no dramatic confrontation and no public argument. The facts spoke loudly enough on their own. As Maya prepared to leave, Chief Reed approached her. Witnesses nearby could not hear the entire conversation, but they saw the chief thank her and shake her hand. The exchange appeared cordial and professional. Whatever conclusions would eventually be reached, it was clear that the concerns raised during the day were being taken seriously. Across the lobby, Brian watched quietly. He had spent hours believing he was evaluating someone else's presence in the courthouse. Instead, the day had revealed that his own decisions were now under scrutiny. The realization seemed difficult to ignore. As Maya walked toward the exit, she did not look back at the crowd gathering behind her. She did not seek attention or recognition. She simply left the building with the same calm confidence she had displayed from the moment she arrived. And as the courthouse doors closed behind her, one lesson had become increasingly clear to everyone who had witnessed the events of the day. Authority could command attention, but professionalism, fairness, and respect ultimately carried far greater weight. Several days after the events at the courthouse, the building returned to its normal rhythm. Lawyers moved through the halls carrying files, clerks answered questions at their desks, and visitors waited quietly for their appointments. From the outside, everything looked exactly the same. But for the people who had witnessed what happened that morning, the memory remained. It became a reminder of how quickly assumptions could shape a situation and how important it was to treat every person with fairness and respect. Officer Brian Walker's review was completed after several conversations with courthouse officials and department leadership. The conclusion was not based on one moment or one person's opinion. It came from a careful review of the full situation, including witness accounts and the professional standards expected from anyone working in a position of authority. Brian was required to complete additional training focused on communication, public interaction, and recognizing how personal judgment could affect professional decisions. For the first time in a long time, he was forced to reflect on the way he approached people. The experience changed how he viewed his role. He had always believed that being confident meant never questioning his own instincts. Now he understood that true professionalism required something more. It required patience, awareness, and the willingness to listen. Meanwhile, Maya Johnson continued her work. The courthouse visit became only one part of a much larger responsibility. She never described the situation as a personal victory. When asked about what happened, she simply explained that public institutions work best when everyone is treated with dignity. Her words stayed with many of the people who had been there that day. Daniel Brooks often thought back to the moment he first recognized Maya. He remembered how many small signs appeared before the truth was revealed. The quiet reactions from employees. The careful looks from officials. The way Maya remained calm even when the situation became uncomfortable. To him, the most powerful part of the story was not the final revelation. It was the fact that she never needed to prove her worth through anger or conflict. Her professionalism spoke for itself. Judge Robert Harrison later reminded courthouse staff that respect was not something reserved for certain people. It was a standard that applied to everyone who entered those doors. He explained that authority was a responsibility, not a reason to stop listening. The story eventually spread beyond the courthouse, not because of a dramatic scene, but because it reflected something many people understood. A single interaction can reveal a person's character. A moment of judgment can become a lesson. And a decision made in a few seconds can have consequences far beyond what anyone expects. The most important question left behind was not about one officer or one visitor. It was a question for everyone. How often do people make assumptions before they truly understand someone else's story? And what would change if every person chose curiosity and respect before judgment? Because sometimes the most meaningful lessons do not come from loud arguments or dramatic moments. Sometimes they come from a quiet person who remains calm, a situation that reveals the truth, and a reminder that fairness begins with how we choose to see one another.